Good morning and welcome to today's discussion on trust and transparency in the deepfake era, developing an industry standard for digital content. My name is Chris Hoffensberger, and I am the Executive Director of Software.org. And I hope that you and your families are doing well and staying healthy in these challenging times. Software.org is a DC-based educational nonprofit that is focused on educating policymakers and the public about the benefits of the software industry, the innovations we create, the jobs that we support in every industry and all across the country. And of course, on days like today, we focus on the solutions that the software industry is creating to tackle some of the biggest challenges today. In this context, we want to explore how software can help address the issue of misinformation and promote the use of authentic content. Today, we will hear from members of the Senate, as well as technology policy, industry, and media experts as we examine approaches to address digital misinformation and authentic content. We'll begin today's event with remarks from Senator Rob Portman and Senator Catherine Cortez Masto. We will then hear from industry leaders Victoria Espinel, President of Software.org and President and CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance, and Dana Rao, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Adobe, about the critical role that software innovation can play in addressing misinformation. We will then turn to Hill leaders, technology, and media experts who will share their thoughts on different aspects that need to be considered in parallel to address the harmful effects of misinformation. We'll do that through a panel discussion, which I will moderate, and I will introduce our distinguished panelists shortly. Now, though, it is my pleasure to introduce the remarks delivered by Senator Portman and Senator Cortez Masto.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. It's great to speak with you all today who are participating in the Content Authenticity Initiative about how the federal government can be a proactive partner in countering the threat of deepfake technology. Truth matters in democracy. And while we've known for a long time that forgery can pose a serious threat to our system of government, deepfakes are a game changer because they can be created so quickly and are so increasingly convincing. That's why I think it's critical we're proactive in coming up with solutions to preserving the truth. I'm proud to be the co-founder and co-chair of what we call the Senate AI Caucus because it gives us a platform to be able to push for meaningful legislation to address the potential benefits and challenges of these new technologies. Last fall, we had our first big success on this front when the Senate passed the Bipartisan Deepfake Report Act, the first deepfake bill to pass through a Chamber of Commerce. It's an important next step for assessing how the government can deal with deepfakes in an effective and unified manner. I'll be offering another piece of legislation, the Deepfake Report Act, as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act in a few weeks. And I'll need your help to be able to get that one across the finish line. My bill requires the Department of Homeland Security to produce an annual report on deepfakes, including where they're being used and by whom, and how they can threaten our national security and our democracy, how to spot them, and how we can better defend against them. While there was a deepfake report provision in last year's NDAA, it was narrowly focused on the intelligence community. For the same reason we need content authenticity initiatives, we need my legislation to be able to look holistically at this issue and comprehensively at possible solutions. I think this bill can be very important. It shows that Congress is serious about the threat of this new technology and that we're committed to finding bipartisan solutions to ensure we're equipped to handle them and protect our democracy. Of course, we're not done yet. I'll continue to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address this critical change and this critical challenge that we're facing. I hope today's roundtable is informative and insightful for all of you. Best of luck in your important work.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto from the great state of Nevada, and I'm so glad to be able to join you by video today to contribute to the important work you're doing to devise ways to battle deepfakes. As you know, deepfake technologies have been used to spoof the voices of leaders in other countries, to spread misinformation during democratic elections, and to confuse and defraud. I'm particularly concerned about the potential impact of deepfakes on our democracy and on consumers. It's so important that we start educating the public so that they know just because you see it on video doesn't mean it's accurate. To supplement that effort to educate, I've introduced the bipartisan bill S-2904, which directs the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Standards and Technology to support research with the private sector to accelerate the development of technologies that could help improve the detection of deepfakes. When we understand more about how to identify deepfake technologies, we'll be able to devise better strategies to stop it. We have been successful in getting this legislation marked up by the Senate Commerce Committee, and now we're working to get it to the Senate floor for possible passage. I welcome your conversation here today, and thank you so much for your thoughts and ideas on how to protect the public from this harmful use of otherwise promising technologies.
Hi, my name is Victoria Espinel. I'm the president of Software.org, the educational foundation of BSA, the Software Alliance. We represent the software industry, including Adobe and among other companies around the world. And we work with policymakers to explain new technology and the contributions of the software industry to society to help make sure that policymaking keeps pace with innovation. For most of 2020, we have all been living through the reality of a global pandemic. The software industry responded very quickly to this unprecedented crisis, and our companies have created tools that let governments and businesses operate remotely, that let first responders communicate more effectively on the ground, and helped increase collaboration on medical research. Software.org has worked with governments around the world to make sure that the tools and resources that are being created by our companies are getting to the hands of those that need them. This crisis has made even more clear the importance of reliable, trustworthy information, the need for users to be able to rely on the material that they find online. That is why we are looking forward to this opportunity to highlight the work that is being done by Congress and by industry to address the issue of inauthentic video content, also known as deepfakes. Inauthentic content, whether it is inadvertent misinformation or deliberate disinformation, undermines trust in the digital environment and requires a multi-pronged response. First, we must educate consumers about the risk of disinformation and give them guidance on when and why they should be able to trust what they are seeing. Next, as we are increasingly seeing, it is important to detect and identify intentionally deceptive media. However, we also know that as digital editing technology improves and becomes more ubiquitous, this effort will become increasingly difficult. That challenge brought together a group of experts and industry representatives to address a third front, transparency. By creating a standard that will help users identify real content and help them understand any changes that were made to that content, technology can help ensure trust in the digital environment, even as the ability to alter content becomes more widespread. I want to thank Senators Portman and Cortez Masto for their work on this issue. And I want to thank all of you for being here with us today. And I encourage you to continue to participate in this important conversation. Now, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dana Rao, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Adobe. Among his many duties, Dana oversees the legal and government affairs team of Adobe. And in this capacity, he has been at the forefront of thinking creatively about how to address this difficult challenge. Thank you all for being here with us today. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dana.
Thanks, Victoria, and appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone to this virtual event. I also want to, as Victoria did, thank Senator Portman and Senator Cortez Masto for their remarks and leadership on this important topic. It definitely is going to take all of us to come up with a solution to this problem. So it's really great to have support from everywhere, government, industry, and organizations. And really want to thank you all for taking your time in this virtual environment. It's a tricky situation. You know, I usually love speaking directly to people and getting the energy back and seeing people smile, and or or feigning indifference or whatever it is. But it's great to engage with the crowd. Here, we're gonna do our best. So I thank you for paying attention. We've come up with an intricate scheme to allow me to advance slides where I say certain words. So if you hear me say the word orangutan occasionally throughout my remarks, that means the slide's gonna advance. And anyway, so you'll see. But it is exciting to be here, and it's an important topic that we're here to talk about. The way we think about this problem at Adobe, the issues that are in society that we're all talking about, especially over the last 6 months, with the pandemic and even going back to fundamental issues like climate change, or talking about issues like racial justice. The key to moving these topics along is the ability to understand and have a shared and common set of facts. And we have to be able to have conversations about what is going on in order to be able to make progress, thoughtful progress on the issues. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, or last week, or maybe it was 5 years ago, I can't tell anymore in this pandemic, there was an article about the riots or the protests in Seattle, or in some cases people refer to them as the riots in Seattle. And that characterization is really important, because the images that were shown of the protesters were important to help you understand the context of what was going on. In one case, a media outlet showed images of an armed gunman in an armed car on fire about the Seattle protests. Later on, it was discovered that those images were fake. And that matters, because the people who are trying to understand this issue, this really sensitive issue about racial justice and the importance of that issue in America, they're going to form some of their opinions by what they see and how they understand the protests and the protesters. They think the protests are violent and that these are, lawless people who are just trying to change the world for their own good and have no regard for society. They're going to have a very different opinion on the issues of racial justice. On the other hand, if they think the protests were peaceful and people were trying to advocate for a cause that matters, then they're going to have a better opinion of the cause and of the protesters. So when the people saw those misleading images, they formed an opinion not only about what was going on, but about the issue. And that's important, because without that understanding of the facts, people are going to be misled. We're not going to be able to have a good conversation to progress forward. And the hardest part about that is it's really hard to undo. Once you've seen those images, once you've seen a picture of an armed gunman at a protest, and then later on, a month later, a week later, you're told, oh, that image, that wasn't really true, it may be too late for you to change your mind. And many people who saw those images are never going to hear that those are incorrect, and their opinions will have been formed. And that's why it's really important to figure out, how can we take on the issue of allowing the public and the consumers to understand who and what they can trust when they consume content online. And this issue is really important, because technology is advancing. It's going to keep moving forward. As Victoria mentioned, the power of editing is just growing. At Adobe, we have a heritage of building the world's best creative tools, allowing people to take their dreams and turn them into reality, creating works of art, digital images and digital video, and also just allowing regular old hobbyists to take their bad vacation photos and turn them into good vacation photos. That's the power of digital content and editing, and we believe in that, and that technology is progressing. However, that is also being coupled with the power of social platforms to disseminate information to millions of people in minutes. So if you take those two technology trends together, that is where the problems rise, because you will be able to edit a photo if it's misleading and disseminate to millions of people in minutes, and there will be a little you can do to retract or undo that. So we have to take on this issue. And at Adobe, we aren't settling for just creating the world's best editing software or using AI in our tech tools just to make the best solutions. We want to take on the consequences of this technology. We want to step up and help be part of the solution to solve this problem. There's a lot of approaches you can think of to address content authenticity. The three pillars that we've talked about, Victoria alluded to: detection, attribution, and education. Those are the three. Detection is ideal. The best solution would be an automated way of looking at an image or video and saying, this is fake, this isn't true. However, detection is also the hardest to accomplish. It's really hard to come up with the automated understanding of truth in an image. Facebook did a laudable thing 9 months ago when they created a deepfake archive. And this deepfake archive created 1 million synthetic videos that allowed people's AI to train to detect whether something was fake or not. Adobe also participated in this. So the idea was, can we come up with an automated way of figuring out if something was fake or not? They just released results of that last week, and it was great results for a preliminary research project. And they said, and the AI system, the leading AI system that was trained on those videos and images, was 65% accurate. So that's great for a research project, but that's not great for a production-ready automation system that would tell you instantly whether or not an image you're consuming in the media is true or not. We have to do much better than 65%. And maybe we'll get there, but at Adobe, we look at this as a cat and mouse game, like cybersecurity. The power of editing is going to get better, as well as the power of detection, but they're both going to advance. And we're not sure that we're ever going to get there on detection. It's important to invest in, and we like to thank Senator Portman and Senator Cortez Masto for their leadership in passing bills to encourage government investment in detection. But when we look at the other two pillars, we think there needs to be investment in those. And education is key, right? We need to make sure the public understands the ability that they have a role to play, that they have an ability to decide of what they should trust. But at Adobe, we're focusing on attribution, and that's what we want to talk about today. So instead of taking on the burden of determining what is true or what is real, or just simply declaring that modifications or edits are bad, our proposal is to create a new system that captures key information about who was responsible, what was changed, and how it was changed. That information, that metadata, as we call it, will be provided to the user along with the asset, the video or image that they're creating. That would travel through the social platforms, and then you'll be able to see that, as you can see in the image above you, and click on it. The user will be able to click on that information, and they'll be able to see the context of the image and what was done to it and who did it, and other information that would be helpful to evaluate the veracity of that content. That metadata will be secure, stored in the cloud and accessible to all, and participation in the system would be optional for the creator. Now, one of the key pillars of this approach that we're talking about today is that the attribution information leaves the value judgment to the user. And that's really important. For example, if I'm showing a picture of a cat, purple fur, and I send that over to Victoria, and she looks at it and she may say, wow, this thing was heavily modified, because she clicks on the button to see whether it's modified or not. Does she care? Probably not. It's a cat. On the other hand, if I text her a picture of a fire in Los Angeles and it was heavily modified, she might care. She might say, this thing isn't true. There's not a fire, there's not a riot. The context of this, the facts matter depending on what the image or content is being shared for. And so what's great about our solution, the solution that we've come together to talk about, is it really puts the responsibility to the user to understand context. They're in the best place to understand the context and evaluate the image or content for themselves. That's the kind of work we're doing with the Content Authenticity Initiative. In October last year, with the New York Times Company and Twitter, we launched this Content Authenticity Initiative, or CAI. And the goal of this group is to create an industry standard for content attribution. This is a technical issue and a deeply human challenge, and that's why we're not just partnering with technology companies, we're partnering with people from different areas and nonprofits and academics, because we need to understand, a lot more than just the technology. We need to understand the sociological aspects of understanding truth and classifying things. So today we're really pleased to announce an important milestone in the progress of this initiative. Following on from the announcement we made last fall, we've been working with a number of companies to create a technical white paper. And this technical white paper sets forth the architecture of the solution that we are hoping will become a standard that everyone can adopt. And for this particular today, what we're announcing is work that was done with Twitter and the New York Times, but also the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And this is today, after this meeting is over, you're going to be able to see a brief of the white paper and understand the high-level details of the architecture. The full white paper will be available for everyone to read later in July. So to conclude, we want to really stress that this is a joint effort. Right? Everybody needs to come together to help solve this problem. It's a long-standing problem, and it's going to require persistent and evolving effort by everyone. Education is critical to minimizing the harmful impact of disinformation. One of the key parts about this solution that we're proposing is that good actors are going to have a place to be trusted. It's an optional system. You can associate your metadata and you can have it reviewed and looked at. Bad actors are not going to opt into this because they don't want you to know that the modifications were made. So how are you going to be able to tell if content is good or bad? Well, eventually, if people have adopted this standard, they're going to expect that when information is being provided to them that is important, whether it's a fire or a riot or whatever, that'll have a way to validate the information in it. They'll expect that. And if there's not a symbol there showing them that they should trust it, they won't trust it. They'll be skeptical. In order for that to happen, though, education is critical. We need to tell the people that they need to understand and be a little skeptical about the content they're consuming online, and that they should look for ways to validate the information that they're viewing. And on the technology side, the industry needs to continue to come together and build this solution to make it an open standard that everyone can adopt. And that's why we welcome this dialogue today, to hear and understand from all the different perspectives and move this important effort forward. The truth matters, and it's our responsibility to keep this truth alive in this new age of online digital content. Thank you. And I'd like to now turn this over to Chris for the panel discussion.
Dana, thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to be with us here today. One of the things when you take on an organization named software.org, sometimes you get a little bit of a software bug. I understand that some of our viewers may have had problems with the sound on the videos at the opening, so we're going to queue those up to run again at the end, and we thank you for your patience and sticking with us. In addition to the key role that software innovation plays in helping prevent the spread of misinformation, robust research on this issue is very important to better define the problem, and lawmakers and content producers also have a very important role to play as we work to tackle this problem. It's my pleasure now to turn to a discussion with experts on this issue who will further highlight why addressing misinformation requires efforts from various stakeholders. Before I turn to the panelists, let me remind everyone that you can submit questions via the chat function of Microsoft Live, located at the right side of your screen. The questions won't be visible to everyone, but they will come to us, and we will get to them as time permits, once all presenters have had an opportunity to share their initial thoughts with us. First, we will hear from Nina Jankowicz. Nina is the Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center for Science and Technology Innovation Program. Previously, she was a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellow, and her work has been published by many media outlets, including the New York Times. Her book, How to Lose the Information War, will be available in a few weeks. And with that, Nina, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris and Dana, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, albeit virtually. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my work in disinformation and kind of give a broader view of where deepfakes and manipulated media fit in to this ecosystem. So my own background is in Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. As Chris mentioned, I spent a year advising the Ukrainian government under the Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship in strategic communications. So on the front lines of the information war, where Russia is continues to this day to meddle in Ukrainian affairs and try out the tactics that it has also unleashed on us more recently. But something that's really important to me is learning the lessons from Central and Eastern Europe that have been experiencing this sort of information manipulation and information operations for more than 10 years now, and certainly well before that in the Soviet period as well. What Dana mentioned is absolutely true, that social media empowers these messages not only to spread farther and faster than they would before, but to target the exact people who are going to be most vulnerable to them, and that's the challenge that we face. As Chris mentioned, I do have a book coming out July 9th, and in that book I discuss the ways that Central and Eastern Europe have tried to tackle this challenge, some ways better than others, hence the title, How to Lose the Information War. But there are a lot of lessons there for us, and I think some of them are really important during this infodemic, during the misinformation and disinformation we're seeing spreading about the unrest around the country in relation to the death of George Floyd. And they have to do with the decline in trust and the societal fissures that exist all over the world, but we've got certainly a lot of them in the United States right now. In 2017 to 2018 alone, the Edelman Trust Barometer measured a 37% decline in trust in institutions in the United States. And one thing I've found myself repeating a lot these days as we deal with the infodemic is that fake news isn't just about cut and dry fakes, and neither are deep fakes. Fake news and disinformation run on emotion. They run on those really visceral reactions that we have, particularly when we are engaging in social media content, looking at things, looking for information that we're uncertain about, right? This is a very highly emotional time, as I'm sure everyone is experiencing, and that makes it a ripe environment for manipulation. It's not just about those cut and dry pieces of fake news or ads bought with Russian rubles or Macedonian dinar. It's exploiting these pre-existing fissures in society, whether that is ethnic fissures, racial fissures, economic, and it exploits the trust gap that I mentioned before. And of course, images and video elicit more of an emotional reaction than textual content. You see it, you consume it, and your reaction is instantaneous. And that causes this content to spread like wildfire around the internet. And we're seeing more of this content than ever before. The platforms are prioritizing visual content, as anyone who's run communications for any sort of organization can attest. You slap a pretty picture or a nice video on something, and that will travel much farther, much faster than a wittily worded tweet. And that's the challenge that we're running into here. How do we slow people down from consuming that content, from sharing it before it's verified? And one of the things that I conclude in my book is that moderating that content is really impossible at scale. We have recently, for the past 4 years, since disinformation has become, a headline piece of news almost every day in the United States, we've been playing whack-a-troll. We are just trying to delete fake accounts, take bad content offline, and this really shouldn't be a content moderation issue. We need to invest in citizens, and indeed all the countries that I cover in my book that have been successful in their response to disinformation invest in education and invest in repairing the fissures in society, repairing those vulnerable parts, rather than just trying to push back and remove content. And for this, I always love to refer to Thomas Jefferson. Bet you didn't know there was fake news in the Founding Fathers era, but I love this quote from him from a letter he wrote in the early 1800s, where he says, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." And I think that's the heart of what this content authenticity initiative gets at. It's one of the reasons I am extremely positive and optimistic about what it can achieve. I do think there are some things that we have to worry about when we are going into this era of looking at authentic content, especially as somebody who's worked in Central and Eastern Europe and in places where people are very much at risk, activists, journalists at risk for the things that they pose on the internet. We need to keep keeping people safe, keeping the things that they want to keep private, private for as much of the time as we can. And I hope, and I'm sure we'll see in the white paper, that there is, protections for those folks involved. I know this is an opt-in system. I'm sure many of those activists and journalists would love to share that information, just knowing that it's not necessarily going to be able to be tracked back to them. That's something that's extremely important. And then also we need to do some awareness building, and I'm really optimistic about the possibility of a public-private partnership in this area, about more engagement from the private sector, especially from social media companies that have nearly ubiquitous access to millions and possibly billions of people's lives around the world, right? People need to understand how to use this content, how to use the tools that we're going to give to them so that they can better navigate the information flows. So to sum up, that is the most important thing we can do. Equip users with the tools they need to better navigate this information environment. And I do believe that is the direction that we're heading. So I'm very optimistic about that. Very happy to be here today. Chris, back over to you.
Thanks, Nina. And now we're going to hear from someone who sits really at the juncture of all of these issues. As a former journalist, I'm excited to have Marc Lavallee here. He's an executive director at the New York Times and heads their R&D department, which focuses on news storytelling experiences for journalists. He joined the Times in 2011 and ran the interactive news desk prior to restarting the company's R&D unit. Before joining the Times, he worked in various roles at the intersection of journalism and technology at NPR, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and National Journal. And Marc, I'm really excited to hear from you in an era where the news cycle is 24 hours and runs at 2.4 seconds. That notion of all the news that fits to print, that's fit to print, really means something different today. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Dana, for having me this morning. And I feel like we've probably had about 4 or 5 news cycles while we've been on this webinar this morning already. So it's definitely coming hot and heavy these days. You know, from that perspective, that's one of the reasons why we, a couple of years ago, started up a new R&D effort to really be able to detach a little bit from that treadmill of news and be able to look out over the next 18 to 24 months to understand how emerging technologies can make us best poised to deal with both the biggest opportunities and the biggest threats that face the near future of our news report and our organization. And I think it's safe to say that this whole misinformation, disinformation scourge is existential for an organization whose mission is to seek the truth and help people understand the world. And so at a company level, there's a lot we're doing dealing with this on multiple fronts in our news report that is, you know, really trying to be out there with aggressive fact checking and get, you know, much more storytelling out there to try to correct the record where it feels like it's going off course, and also making sure that our journalists and our processes are protected from being duped by misleading information with more sophisticated forensic tools and analysis, and being able to do that in real time in response to how these things unfold. But I think, as we've seen, and one of the reasons why we're here today talking about this from a software and systems perspective, is that this problem goes beyond any one organization, and it definitely goes beyond just journalism and media as well. And you know, I think to us, it feels like there are some of these missing pieces of the internet, protocols and standards that need to be developed, because you know, the way we built this 40 some odd years ago now wasn't really designed to sort of deal with these kinds of consequences that allow for the sharing of trusted information from, you know, all around the internet without tamping down on free speech and free expression. And so, you know, I think now that we live in this era where we do have these incredibly powerful publishing tools, which are by and large good and let anyone say anything, we definitely need to deal with the fact that anyone can say anything. And you know, so as we think about things that are not true, even using an example like satire, as someone who grew up reading The Onion, we obviously want to make sure that those contexts continue to thrive, that we continue to have that, but that we are able to tamp down on things that are very similar in construct, but are done with the intent to deceive, right? So I think Dana's example of protest photos is a great one, because that could be a fake photo of a police car on fire used in a misleading way to misrepresent a peaceful protest. It could also be a real photo from a different place at a different time. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the past couple of years is that one of the most effective ways to make things that are deceptive, that travel well around the internet, is to use real media in misleading contexts. And that could be that kind of photo example. It could be taking news clips and stitching them together in misleading ways to peddle coronavirus conspiracies, and then taking the brand mark or bug of a media organization like the CBC or BBC and applying that to the video, right? Those are things that are very easy for people to do at this point. Those can really lead to a tremendous amount of confusion. It also, it doesn't need to be deceitful, right? I think what we've seen over the past couple of years is people, even with pure motives, can lead to a tremendous amount of confusion. One of our go-to examples is with the Amazon wildfires last year, having celebrities and world leaders tweet out these photos of the wildfires, like Emmanuel Macron putting out a photo that was taken by a person who died in 2003, probably not from last summer, right? So if you're a world leader and you're unintentionally peddling misinformation, then we definitely have a problem where people can be doing that with malintent. So how do we solve it? Well, the way we've been thinking about it is really trying to start with the user, right? What are the things that we can put in front of people as they're just going about their day, particularly on social media platforms, that help them be best positions to make decisions that are in their best interest, particularly before they then share that information on with their own networks. And if you think about it a little bit from a user rights perspective, as a user on the internet, you should have the right to know where things came from. Like in some ways, it should be that simple. You're scrolling through a news feed, you should be able to press and hold on a photo on your phone and see where it came from, right? You should be able to scrub a video and get the same information. In practice, is that something you would do all the time? Almost certainly not. But it's something that should be available, that as we add to these signals that help you understand what you're seeing in context, that it can start to induce a critical mindset, particularly when you are distracted by 2 or 3 other things, right? Like you're watching a webinar, listening to someone drone on about misinformation, while also checking Instagram. We want to be able to create these kinds of speed bumps that aren't stop signs. We're not making these judgments in all of these cases. That's something that needs a big fake news label on it or anything like that. It's just trying to say, hey, wait a second. This photo is from 4 years ago, but the story says it's from yesterday. There might be something going on here. Just be careful, take a closer look, right? So that idea of attribution or provenance is not new. And one of the reasons why we're working with Adobe is that it does feel like there are pieces of technology that need to be created and stitched together in order to be able to make this work end to end. That you should be able to go from the moment someone takes a photo all the way to when you see that photo on social media and every step in between, to make sure that we have essentially the right sort of carriage from place to place to make sure that all the metadata about every change that happens to that photo is being recorded properly. That's something that the Times has done for a long time. If you look at the paper, we have photo credits, we have bylines, things like that. We have a long history of communicating this kind of provenance on the channels and platforms that we own. We're literally sitting on top of the data that's needed to make this happen, at least for the things that we publish. We want to make sure that this works for everybody else as well. And not just in journalism, but in other contexts. People covering protests and repressive regimes and wanting to be able to put that material out anonymously and so on. And so the way that we've plugged into this is really engaging in 2 projects. If you think about how they kind of fit together end to end, the first, as what we're really focused on today with the Content Authenticity Initiative with Adobe and Twitter, to build on how Dana framed it, is really something that allows for the capture and documentation of responsible edits from the point of capture all the way outward. And as a news organization, one of the things that's really important to us is, and our comms people hate it when I say this, but the New York Times manipulates every photo that we publish because we tone them and we do some slight cropping and things like that. But we do so within the standards and principles of photojournalism, right? We don't do things that are misleading. But if you were to look at a photo just forensically, you would see that it's been edited. So being able to show, these are all the edits that we made to a photo. This is what was actually captured in the moment on the camera, and this is the version you're seeing, which is touched up a little bit just for comprehension, is incredibly important to us. At the same time, one of the things that's really important to us is that in the default case, we want to be able to show as much of that information as possible. But like in many other situations, we have anonymous sources. There are people and information that we want to protect and occlude from this process, right? If we do a photo assignment in someone's home, we don't want to put the geolocation of their home in the metadata of all of the photos that we then share about them. And so we need to build these principles and standards in a way that allows us to be able to say explicitly when we are holding back information as well, right? And I think that's true of other creators in other contexts. And so that's the CAI side of it. The second effort that we're focused on is this project called Origin, which is a collaboration with the BBC, Microsoft, and the Canadian Broadcasting Company. I think you're going to hear a lot of the same names today because we're all trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together. Origin, you can really think of as a complement to CAI for media organizations, where it's from the point of publishing onward, as we are sharing photos and video and audio publicly. What is a way, if you're a social media platform or you're a browser plugin, to be able to start with a piece of media, say a photo, and be able to say, hey, did this actually come from the New York Times? Is this something you actually stand behind? Because this person's claiming it is, right? So you can think of it almost like a two-factor authentication for media, so that there's a consistent way to look up that information, right? That as we publish these things through all of these other platforms and essentially like historically have lost control of how they go out there, we now have a mechanism for being able to regain some of that control around that presentation. So these are both multi-year efforts. That, you know, we're making progress on both fronts. To Dana's point, we have this white paper coming out with CAI, and we have a technology preview of the Origin work coming in September. But these are multi-year efforts, and they're loaded with a ton of questions that we don't yet have answers to. You know, how do we make these work in decentralized fashions? I'll bring in the word blockchain as a possibility there. What's the right governance? What is a news organization, right? How do we make sure that these work in other countries and other contexts when it comes to different types of press freedom laws and so on? So there's a ton of work ahead, but we're excited about the progress we've made already. And I think to try to sum up how we're approaching this as an organization and working with all these other organizations. I generally try to avoid sports analogies, but as someone who's been starved to see a single point basket or goal in months, you know, I think when it comes to misinformation, for us, the best defense is a good offense. So thank you.
Thanks, Marc. That's really helpful, and it is interesting to talk about those kind of digital darkroom techniques being revealed, kind of what's always happened in darkrooms to photos. So now I want to turn to the legislative perspective of this issue. First, we will hear from Sam Mulopulos. Sam is the primary advisor for international trade and technology policy to Senator Portman, and he's the director of the Senate AI Caucus, which was created last year to help inform policymakers of the technological, economic, and social impacts of advances in AI. Sam is the lead staffer behind the Deepfake Report Act, which in 2019 was the first deepfakes bill to ever pass the Senate. And so with that, Sam, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. It's really wonderful to be here and get to be a part of this and hear from everyone. You know, I guess I'll give you a hypothetical. Okay, imagine we're on the eve of the presidential election, and a foreign tourist captures one of the presidential candidates doing something unseemly, and it ricochets around the country. We could see how that might be a problem. But what's interesting is this is actually not a hypothetical. This is actually a real thing that happened in the United States. And if you think it happened recently, you would be wrong, because it happened in 1844, and the president was James Polk. You know, there was this guy, a Baron von Rohrbach, who was a Tocquevillian character, who was traveling through the United States, and he wrote this book shortly before the election of 1844, talking about some of the implicating James Polk in some pretty bad stuff. And it turns out the whole thing is made up, the Rohrbach forgery. And I think it just shows the point, and Nina got at this, that I think when we want to address deepfakes in the most sustainable way, I mean, we're really talking about restoring a civic culture that values truth and trust and is sometimes skeptical about the right things, but also more charitable about other things. And I think to paraphrase Nina, right, historically we had, you know, the citizens of this country would whack the trolls themselves. You know, there's a reason why the Rohrbach forgery didn't catch on. And you can imagine trying to govern in, you know, during the Civil War. You know, Lincoln is fighting off the Copperheads who want to end the war. Can you imagine if we had the internet then? It seems impossible that we would have been successful. Or the civil rights movement, you know, Orville Faubus is tweeting. I mean, can you imagine, you know, being able to make any progress during that? So So I do think we need to, there is a bit of a, the strategic side. I guess there's two things here that I see it as, and as the AI caucus, our view is somewhat like this, that there's a strategic element and there's a tactical element. And the strategic element is just restoring this robust civic culture in the United States. And a lot of those policy prescriptions are not necessarily specific to technology or deepfakes or GANs or anything. It's how do you have more manufacturing jobs? How do you legislate with the principle of subsidiarity in mind? How do you protect intermediate institutions so that people improve their capacity for self-government? On the tactical side, that's where we are able to get in the weeds and think about some of the technological solutions. And one of the things that we've put out is this Deepfakes Report Act, which, given the kind of First Amendment issues at play with this issue, we wanted to make sure that before we started legislating on this, we had the full context, the full scope, and all the information. And so we asked the Department of Homeland Security to do, in consultation with academics and industry and other agencies, to do a very wide-reaching report on this topic, and not just our foreign adversaries, but things happening within the United States, the technological the technology behind deepfakes, the countermeasures against deepfakes. And so it's a very comprehensive report. There was some language in the NDA last year about a reporting bill that I think David will tell you the hand that he had in that. But we're hoping to get this in the NDA this year because it is something that is more comprehensive and addresses some of these non-national security specific instances. So in terms of kind of the tactical side of things, I mean, I think this is where we're talking about the Content Authenticity Initiative, and it's amazing. This is exactly what we need to be doing, and it's kind of grassroots in a way because it's coming from industry. I think Congress, the role we can play here is we are still in a fact-finding role, but I do think as we begin to move into a more active legislating role, we want to go find the issues that the tools that are already available to us. And David will talk more about this. He's got a lot of great ideas in this regard, but we don't always need to reinvent the wheel with this issue. And so, I think we need to look and see what is off the shelf. And certainly the AI caucus, I'll just close by saying when we started the caucus and Senator Portman, we were talking about this and I said, okay, Senator, imagine it's 1903 and the Wright brothers just flew an airplane and you're a senator. You got to go figure out what this means for the world and the country and society and help, craft the rules for this. And I think he felt very empowered about that. He said, let's go do the AI caucus. So that's really what we're trying to do with the caucus is bring some expertise into the Senate about these issues and make sure that when we legislate, we're legislating correctly. We're not shooting from the hip, and we're doing it thoughtfully in a way that actually reflects the nature of the technology and what people want to see from that technology. So again, thank you guys so much for being here, and look forward to answering some questions.
Thanks, Sam. That's a great example, and I think I will love talking about Wilbur and Orville Wright, only this time the plane is building itself and flying itself, and how do we explain that to people? And so next, I want to turn to David Dorfman, the Legislative Director and General Counsel for Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Representative Yvette Clarke from New York. David drafted the Deepfakes Accountability Act, the first deepfakes bill introduced in the House, as well as the first deepfakes provision signed into law in last year's Intelligence Authorization Bill. And as an elected delegate for the Oregon State Bar, David also introduced and successfully passed the first state-level effort to address the impacts of deepfakes on our court system. So with that, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here today. As we've already touched on, deepfakes present both promise and peril. But the question for lawmakers is not really whether deepfakes are good, bad, or both. Rather, it's how do we mitigate the negative implications of a technology that, frankly, is already out of the bag, and do so in a way that is constitutionally sound. My boss introduced and I drafted the first bill in the House to regulate deepfakes, the Deepfakes Accountability Act. In fact, as Sam alluded to, two elements of this bill were signed into law last year as part of the Intelligence Community Authorization and NDAA. Specifically, ODNI must assess and seek to combat China and Russia's weaponization and deepfakes for espionage and, as Nina alluded to, political influence operations. Not only that, they must report to Congress and notify us immediately if any state seeks to use a deepfake to interfere in an election. These are but two provisions of a 28-page bill. Most critically, the Accountability Act also proposes that creators of deceptive deepfakes, that being videos where you have an expectation that what you're watching is real, so not the onion for Marc, you have to disclose and label that you've altered the content. Basically, think about any old campaign ad you watch, right? I'm Gene Smith and I approve this message. In the same way, if you're creating a deceptive deepfake, you should have to include written and audio disclosure that says, hey guys, hope you enjoy the video, but by the way, it's been altered and here's how. And to make sure that little piece of things can't just be left out of the mix, deleted after the fact, there has to be embedded metadata. In the bill, we call it a digital watermark. Producers of video editing software, in turn, would be required to facilitate those disclosures, that metadata. So kudos to Adobe for getting in front of that one. One key addition, and I'd say distinction, between the Accountability Act and various state-level bills that have been proposed or passed out there, is that instead of banning deepfakes in particular contexts, it requires most of them to be labeled. This helps preempt a lot of the First Amendment challenges that could arise when and if this was passed into law. It also does a couple other really cool things. Folks, the fact is, victims aren't always going to be able to identify, to civilly sue or pursue criminal charges against who created that deepfake that's hurting their reputation. So the bill creates an in rem litigation procedure to, in those instances, allow victims to sue the video itself. You guys are probably saying, David is crazy, how can you sue a video? This sounds novel, but the procedure already exists. Cyber swatting. So if someone registers a domain name, a URL address that infringes on your trademark and you can't identify who owns the website, you can essentially go after the domain name itself. Translating that into the deepfakes context, it's beautiful because it doesn't just give deepfake creators the ability to vindicate their reputation in a courtroom. No, it lets them open up the discovery process, use subpoenas, and maybe even figure out who did create that deepfake. I'd also like to flag how the bill updates our false personation and identity theft statutes. Folks, we all know we already have laws on the books that prevent you from using a fake ID, you can't use a fake passport, don't even try impersonating a federal official. But unfortunately, a lot of those old statutes have never been updated to account for digital impersonation. This bill does that. Now, finally, in my personal capacity as an elected delegate of the state bar for the great state of Oregon, I'm not going to tell you guys if I'm a Ducks or a Beavers fan, I also wrote and secured passage of the first state-level initiative in the country to secure our court system, our justice system, our civil litigation system against the threat of deceptive deepfakes. Think about it. In this new world, how do we have faith in body camera footage, in interrogation tapes, and deposition videos? It's a good question. That stuff can all be easily altered now. Now, currently in the state of Oregon and most states around the country, any recording that contains audio of your voice, that's self-authenticating evidence. It means you don't need to bring in anything extrinsic to prove it in court, folks. Man, as deepfakes go mainstream, that is simply going to have to change. And it is going to have to change fast. Not just an issue for litigators, though. I mean, mark my words, heck, maybe it's already happened. The day is coming where there's a deepfake of a CEO announcing bad earnings, and you wake up the next morning and the stock has plunged, and that deepfake creator has made a pretty penny on the dimes of honest shareholders. You know, in national security circles, I'm executive director of the Congressional Intelligence and National Security Association. We always talk about this hypothetical of a president in a deepfake video announcing a missile strike and that setting off an unintentional war. We're going to see that same exact scenario play out, but in domestic contexts as well. The one thing all these hypotheticals have in common They speak to the necessity, absolute necessity, of efforts like the Content Authenticity Initiative. Congress can require deepfake creators to label their content, but the fact is, if the technology doesn't exist to insert those disclosures, it's just words on a page. That's why the Content Authenticity Initiative, it's a critical step to bridging that gap, empowering the good actors out there to foster trust in the content they produce or distribute. You know, when we go on Twitter, if we see an account for a celebrity or a famous politician, and we don't see that check mark next to it, we know odds are it's probably fake. We're not going to trust that that's actually the celebrity. Government, the private sector, civil society, everyone in this space, it is critical. We have to work together. We have to work together now towards a future where we foster that same level of skepticism of video content that hasn't been authenticated. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, David, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your views. We have a little bit of time left for a brief Q&A, so we'll try to get through as many questions that we've been getting from folks as we can. And Nina, I want to turn first to you, if I could, please. Could you talk about what makes deepfake so provocative and effective as a tool for disinformation? I understand people tend to believe what their eyes and their ears are seeing and hearing because seeing is believing, but what about this I can't believe what I just saw? And why do we tend to believe information that is obviously salacious?
Right, and I actually don't even think it necessarily has to be salacious. It's all about that energy. So my favorite example from the 2016 Russian ads is this golden retriever. Somebody did a bad Photoshop job and put in like a red and white star, holding an American flag between his paws, and the text on it says like if you think it's going to be a great week. Who wouldn't share that dog? I would share that dog. And so this is just a good example of it doesn't necessarily have to be salacious. It's all about, capitalizing on energy and emotion. And we see that used for good and bad. And certainly when you see someone speaking, that emotion is then driven even farther. You're hearing it, you're seeing it. And people are just incentivized to share on many of these platforms. That's why we really need to increase the friction between people seeing and consuming a piece of content and what needs to happen before they share it. So for instance, I really love, this is just a recent example, the Twitter initiative to create an interstitial. If you've not opened a link that you're about to retweet, it asks you if you really want to retweet that link that you didn't read. I think inserting things like that to slow down the sharing and amplification of content is something that we need to look more into, to test. But in the absence of anything else that we know works for sure, certainly a good thing to introduce, especially as we head into a really contentious election cycle. Thanks.
Thanks, Nina. And Dana, that idea of friction, I think Marc called them speed bumps, but not stop signs, is kind of similar to what's going on with CAI. It's this opportunity to really trust by verifying what's going on. Can you talk about the momentum with the Content Authenticity Initiative and provide some details maybe on the CIA white paper that you mentioned and the technical design approach that you and the partners are taking?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we should change it to attribution to make it easier to say. We're really excited about the progress we've made. It's technical solutions are hard, right? And so we talked about the idea back in November. We had a big summit in January. We brought 60 companies together and industry organizations to talk through all the concepts that we might want to address. And as Marc has said, there's a lot of interesting technical and philosophical questions and usability questions that have to be sorted out before we can go live. Internally at Adobe, we're still targeting a fall release of working code for us to have Photoshop work with this system. But externally, more challengingly is how do we get the industry aligned around a solution that everybody can live with? And we really wanted to work for platforms. We needed to work for the content creators. We needed to work for the editors. And the media organizations. So it's got to have a bunch of stakeholders all have to align. The work that we're publishing in July is really going to set forth the key pillars of how we're going to approach that. And Nina mentioned privacy. Privacy is a key part of this, right? Really making sure that it's an opt-in system. Creators need to choose to want to do this. And in our case, our creators are our customers. most of them want attribution. They want to be known. They want to have their names associated with their work. So that's great. They're going to want to opt in, or they're going to want to make sure their work it can be validated, and that's also great. But if they want to choose to remain anonymous or keep some information back, that should be their choice. That's kind of a key pillar and part of the system that we're looking at. We also want this to be, as I mentioned before, cloud-based. It has to be accessible. Marc mentioned blockchain, but there's got to be a way for people to access this information, and that's part of the architectural decision. And it's got to work with a bunch of workflows, as Marc mentioned. Again, media organizations have workflows already for provenance and attribution and credit checking, and this system has to work within those existing processes in order for it to be adopted, and this is only going to work if it's adopted. And so trying to make sure this thing works with all those different workflows is really critical. But I'm very excited to have this paper drafted. It's getting peer reviewed by the people who've been working on it, published hopefully in weeks, and then everyone will get a chance to look at it, comment on it. Then we'll start continuing to build to a prototype that we hope to get launched. But Marc, again, as Marc said, I keep quoting Marc. Thank you, Marc. Long-standing problem, lots of issues, is a multi-year effort. So we're just going to keep iterating and grinding. Thanks.
That's great. That is a great development, and it is great to have one more piece of education going on out there as this election approaches. And you mentioned Marc, and Marc, Nina mentioned what's happened at Twitter with the notion of the pause before retweeting. Can you talk maybe about what is happening at the Times on the posting of images or videos that are being shared during a breaking news situation? Is there a scenario in place for the Times? Are there procedures there? And I think we may have lost Marc. So I'm gonna kick it to you, Sam, and maybe you could talk about what you see as Congress and the administration's role relative to combating the harmful effects of deepfakes. Over to you, Sam.
Great. I think it's a great question. I think kind of just going back to that framework that I talked about originally, you know, it's breaking things down into, can you hear me? Okay. It's breaking things down into what is the strategic and what is the tactical. And with the tactical, it's pushing things like the Deepfakes Report Act. It's pushing things like the Deepfakes Accountability Act or provisions within that, and actually trying to get into the weeds and make kind of these technical changes. But at the strategic level, it's just about going and thinking and pulling back all the way and saying, why in 1844 did the election not turn out based on this forgery? And what were the civic, you know, kind of cultural civic attributes of 1844 that led to that? And we don't want to go back to 1844. But we also don't want to say that there's nothing worth preserving. And that's when you talk about things like, well, Americans worked for small businesses, generally ones they owned. You know, maybe that's something we want to foster. You know, a manufacturing culture, a culture of neighborliness, you know, unions and churches and bowling leagues and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the most sustainable thing. I think we can make a lot of technical changes, but at the end of the day, you know, the GANs keep getting better, and it's kind of a race against time. And so that's why I think that something that Congress can really do is, as we legislate on things that are totally unrelated to technology and totally unrelated to deepfakes, I think we should keep in mind the benefit that has for the things that we're talking about. And it's unintended, but you know, we talk about unintended consequences as a bad thing. This might be an unintended consequence as a good thing.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And so, David, maybe if I can quickly turn it to you and you know, to talk quickly about Congress's biggest concerns relative to deepfakes and what keeps you awake at night with this issue, and when you think about deepfakes, and how does Congresswoman Clarke's legislation address those concerns?
Well, generally speaking, I think Congress and state legislatures have focused primarily on election interference, as well as the threat of fake pornography, and for good reason. I mean, those are two of the most serious threats. You know, election interference speaks for itself. 96% of deepfakes, a recent report said out there, involve fake pornography of women. It's horrific. That being said, those are only two of the situations where deepfakes present a real threat to our society. I talked about market manipulation earlier, alluded to fake evidence in courtrooms. But what about just harm to ordinary people's reputations? Look, if there's a deepfake of a celebrity, they can fight back in the press. They have their Twitter account at their disposal. But an ordinary person, you or me, a colleague, creates a deepfake to sabotage you so you don't get that promotion. How do you fight back against that? Those are really tough questions. And one thing I worry about is that maybe Congress will solve the more obvious problems, will enact protections in the context of election interference. But do we leave the rest unregulated? This sounds hypothetical, but look at privacy. We have protections for children. We have privacy protections for health data. But then everything else, because we got the easy fruit taken care of, was left unregulated. And only now are we looking at an American GDPR. So I think that's an important thing for us to consider. I'd also say we don't just need to combat the threat of deepfakes deceiving viewers. We also need to think about deepfakes creating distrust in actual videos, right? That's an equally serious threat, and it's one that lends itself to even fewer easy answers. So just some food for thought.
That's great, David. Thank you. And I think we've got time for maybe two more quick questions. Marc, you're back. And hopefully you caught my question about the times and maybe some of the procedures that might be in place on that breaking news cycle to kind of slow things down and make sure that what is printed is authentic.
Yes. And, I think the obvious part of the answer is that because everything we publish amplifies that piece of information, that we have to use extreme caution in putting anything out there that is unconfirmed or has been sort of definitively known to be altered or fake. In the print era, when I talk about the tagline, all the news that's fit to print, omission was a signal unto itself. If it wasn't on the front page, then it wasn't worthy. We don't have that same signal on it, directly on social media and things like that. So in general, what the industry needs in this era is that equivalent, right? And it's very tricky to find that right modulation to say, we see what you're seeing and we're trying to investigate it and figure out what's going on here and where it came from, particularly in these situations where all of this is unfolding in real time, right? The first 18 hours or so after something is put out there, you think about the past several election cycles, I guess going all the way back to 1844, of either leaked audio that is real, that is missing context, or things that are fabricated. It's really that time element that is really crucial for us in being able to put some veracity to these claims. The single biggest, I think, or I shouldn't say this in superlative terms, a big positive bit of momentum, I think, is seeing what the platforms, Google and Twitter in particular, have been doing over the past several weeks and starting to put these claims directly on these pieces of information as they travel, right? We feel like that's the essential bit. That's the hook to make sure that as people see these things, they're also getting that proper context. And that also creates the opportunity to be able to put more information behind that as well, whether that's about the asset itself, which is a lot of the work that we're doing with CAI, or referential context, right? That here's the Snopes explainer that explains why this thing is fake or something like that, right? I think what we know and what we're starting to really see is that putting those things together is essential for combating misinformation. So I think it's a really positive signal.
That's great, Marc. Thank you. And so, Dana, I think I'd like to throw our last question over to you because it's a question that we're getting a lot from viewers today, and it has to do with Section 230. In the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in Congress and the administration to revisit Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides liability protections to online businesses for user-generated content that they host. Can you talk really briefly about how the Content Authenticity Initiative, I slowed it down that time, addresses some of those concerns around Section 230?
CAI also works. So it's It's a great question. The way we think about 230, like first 230 has a super important place for regulating content online. As you know, first TOUs, terms of use, are really important by the social platforms. There's some content people post that's illegal or harmful, needs to be taken down. TOUs allow you to do that. That's really important. I think that the thing you want to think about is, you know, if there's a civil discourse on a platform and you're enjoying it, then great. And then if there are people are pushing things you don't like, obviously you can always opt out. And if it violates their TOU, then the platforms are free to take that down. The questions that come up lately are about, you know, whether or not the platform should exert value judgments on things that are not violating their TOU. If that's the case, and that's an open debate of whether things do or don't. What's great about the Content Authenticity Initiative is, as I mentioned earlier, we're really putting the facts in front of the consumer to decide. So we are, as Marc said, we're attaching the metadata about how the image was modified, how it was modified, and who modified it, along with the image. And then the user clicks on a button, sees the information, and decides for themselves. So it is not the platform or the media company or someone telling you, don't trust this. It is the consumer getting the information and making a choice. Are they always going to make the right choice? Are they going to choose to believe something that maybe they shouldn't believe? You know, that happens. Apparently, it happens in ancient histories that I've learned today in this meeting. So that's going to happen. But we can't solve every problem. But by putting that data out there and letting the good actors be trusted and having the opportunity for them to advertise that they want to be trusted, I think the public will be able to have that information and do the right thing and still comport with some of the 230 questions that were being discussed today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. I want to thank you and thank all of our presenters for an engaging and informative discussion today. It's clear that this is a multi-part initiative that requires collaboration and cooperation from many different perspectives. Software.org looks forward to continuing to facilitate dialogues like these among stakeholders that are invested in addressing this issue. And we look forward to continue working with all of you. This concludes today's event. I want to thank everyone for attending and thank the senators for their remarks. Those of you who weren't able to hear the senators, we will share their videos with you, post them on our site, leverage software to get that message out to the best of our ability. But I want to thank you again, and this wraps things up on our end.